All right, once you have that new layer here, we're actually going to start getting into working on the three images that you're going to make for this assignment, or at least part of this assignment. So make sure that this area over here looks just like this. Should have a background that is locked. The image of the girl, name it girl, is locked, and then a fresh layer on top of this. Um, and we'll kind of get going here with what we're going to do. So this first image, I just want to talk to you about using adjustment layers and how you can stack those on top of each other to make some pretty significant changes. And I also want to show you a little bit about camera raw adjustments as well. Um, let's do camera raw first, just because it's sort of unique unto itself. And once we actually go through that, we probably won't go back to it for a little while. All right, so if you come up here to the top menu here, you've got this thing for filters. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here which everybody is usually drawn to first because it's the easiest way to click a button and make things happen. I would kind of stay away from it for a little bit. Um, let's just kind of look at all this at this specific thing here. So for camera raw filter, um, click on that. And what this does, if you've taken photography class with Jose, you already know what this thing is, more than likely. If not, you're going to very soon if you're just in his class, but I'm going to give you a very super brief introduction as to what it is and how powerful the changes are. And I should actually make sure that I've selected this layer, and I'm going to go ahead and unlock it so it'll let me make changes to it, because it does work on a specific layer unless we do it as an adjustment layer, which we'll worry about later. Camera raw filter. Open it up. It's going to give you all of this stuff here. A lot of tools up at the top. You can hover over most tools and they'll tell you exactly what they do. So for those of you that are, again, in photography, most of this stuff is going to make sense. Some of it's going to be a little weird. We're not going to mess with much of any of it. I just want to show you the main tools over here and how strong they actually are. Now, this is a JPEG image, so it's not going to do anywhere near as much as an actual raw image would. If you don't know, when you are using a decent camera, or even honestly, phones now have apps that'll let you allow you to produce raw images. What that means is that it's different than a JPEG or a PNG or TIFF or whatever, some proprietary format that a camera or a phone may give you. A raw image is a universal format that has much more data inside of it. So color data, exposure data, all of the things that sort of allow you to make manipulations to photos. Raw images have more of it. They actually don't compress the data. So most camera formats, for you, if it's a JPEG especially, that's a compressed file format. Camera raw is lossless. It means it doesn't lose any information. So all of the image data that your camera, the lens, and the sensors can gather is all inside the raw file. They're substantially larger than JPEGs. So this is not going to do the same thing. I just want to show you some of the adjustments and how they work. If we had an actual raw image, which we will get into in another video much later, you can see how much better these changes actually affect the image. So let's look at these real quick. The menu over here, we'll go through a couple of these, but this is what you're going to open up on. You have some options on here, down here, about how you want to display like what you've done. So if you want to look at them side by side, and so you were to make changes or whatever, you could see them right next to each other. You can do a split screen where you can hover over, which was the last one there, and then the before after on top of each other, before after in the middle. So if I make these changes here, you can see that it does that. So you can kind of keep going through and adjust those as you like. And for these, if I remember correctly, I think you can alter these, but they may have changed that. Not for sure. Let's get this back. All right. I'm going to switch this over to just the main view, and I'm going to change that adjustment I just made. So all of these things here, Temperature, again, it's color temperature, cool or warm. So blue is a cooler color. You can see that it makes these adjustments. Uh, Yellow going into red, warmer color tones. The difference with changing a lot of things in RAW is that it still preserves a lot of the actual contrast, a lot of the tones that are in the image. And again, it's less than when we're using a JPEG, um, but it doesn't distort the image as much as, say, a filter would in Photoshop. Um, so you can see you can adjust the tint. The exposure is just essentially like if you were going back in time and changing your exposure settings on your camera. So if you wanted to overexpose, underexpose, etc., you can do that all here. So you can make these very minor adjustments. Contrast, we all hopefully at this point knows what that is. It's the difference between light and darks. If you want things to have less contrast between them, more of a neutral feel, you can pull your contrast down, and you'll probably see a lot of this in a lot of Instagram photography. You'll see a lot of low contrast images where they've come in and turn the contrast down, and then they'll try to come back and sort of adjust the blacks, and it gets this very specific sort of Instagram filter feel that I don't know, I see a lot of. So you can make some very minor changes and sort of go for that. You can pull down the vibrance and saturation and sort of lose a lot of the strong color tones. Turning up the clarity will help you regain some of those blacks that you're losing in the contrast. And so you can see very quickly we can make significant changes to that image, and it still maintains all of its resolution and clarity. We are starting to get some artifacting here, but that's just because of the low light situation. But you can see that it still is uh, okay. It's not overly damaged. We can always change this stuff back, um, but it makes very clean and very powerful edits depending on how far you want to get into it. All right, let me pull a couple of these back so that we can see a little bit more here. All right, look at that a little more natural. So you can make these changes here. So if I wanted to, instead of just brightening the photo, if I wanted to control the actual highlights, I have that option here. So you can see that when we zoom in a little bit, how it can basically enhance those brights without turning the brightness up across the board. It just affects the bright areas, the highlights, the brightest areas, I should say. This will do the similar thing, but it tries to find pure whites. So you can get some interesting effects by tweaking those too. The same thing with the shadows and the blacks. Shadows, let me zoom out a little bit. And if we turn this down, you can see that anything it's the Photoshop feels as a shadow, it can control that lightness and darkness of that without overly brightening the entire image. So we can lighten the shadows, and then we can pull the blacks down to try to regain a little bit of that if we wanted to, and start making these adjustments to stylize this image, whatever way we're kind of shooting for here. So this is, it's starting to get a little too intense, but we can make those changes. I can pull this bright vibrance back up, and you can see all these very simple changes that don't overly distort the image. Saturation and vibrance are a little bit different. Vibrance will enhance colors while trying to keep the actual tone levels between different colors. Saturation just basically piles on the color. It's a little more heavy-handed. So if we move over to some of these tabs, I'll give you a quick example of sort of what they will do. Tone curves. I'm not going to get too much into this, but curves allow you to make very controlled adjustments to light, dark, to color tones, exposure. Like again, you're going to do a lot of this in photography, and I don't want to get into it too much because it's a much longer conversation and very difficult to kind of compress into something like this. So we can mess with the actual tone curves and get some really interesting effects where I'm actually pulling this down, and we're maintaining all of these bright the highlights and the brightness here, and getting a kind of a believable environment where we still have this rich color and texture and highlights and everything here, but the background starts to fade away a little bit. We're pulling it into more darkness. And you can make multiple adjustments on these curves, and you can see how tricky they are to keep them in the realm of believability. So I'm going to back up a little bit and just get us back to this. Um, there we go. So we'll go back to normal here. Details, sharpening, noise reduction, that kind of stuff. You can get into that a little bit if you need to sharpen the images. You can also do it with layer masks and control the way that you do all of these. This is where it starts to get a little interesting for quick changes. You have these three things here: U, which is basically your colors, saturation, the amount of color, and luminance, which is the brightness of colors. But you can see that it's split up into all of these different colors as opposed to a broad just change the saturation slider. So if I wanted to, I could come in and control the hue and saturation of specific colors. So if I wanted to make it that all of the uh, reds, I could alter their color. You can see when I slide this what it does to her hair and anything that's sort of affected by the actual color red. And greens, which there's not that many of with what we have here, it's not going to show too much. Magentas, not much, but you can control it by the actual color, saturation, the amount of that color. So we can tone the reds down quite a bit if we want to. Raise the oranges and bring in a totally different feel here. Illuminates the brightness of colors. So if I wanted to darken the brightness of just red, we can do that here. Or just greens, see if it'll give us much. Not going to give us much there. Yeah, not going to do it. Oranges, we can, again, lightness, darkness, specific to those colors. Split toning, again, you can change specific colors and then control the balance. It's not really anything that we need to get into too much right now, but you can basically put in two different color tones for the shadows and highlights, and then control the balance between the two and get some very interesting effects. We can change the overall kind of color palette here. Excuse me. Lens correction, it's a good way to correct any artifacts that are going to be from your camera lens. If you got curving or anything around the edges, you can change that there. This is camera calibration, where you can get specific presets, or I'm sorry, specific, if I could talk, you can load in specific presets for cameras and stuff here, and change those manually. And you can also save presets here. So if all of these changes that we've made, if we wanted to save them as a preset, we could click on this button and make a new one. All right, that's camera raw. So if we wanted to keep these changes, I would just hit OK, and you can see that it changes our photo for us below. And there we go. If I want to undo those, I can just back up to a previous step.